Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code. Please allow us to wait for a minute or two as the participants queue circles into the Zoom room. And a note to staff, Senator Skinner says that the link that she has is not working. So if you can get that to her, that'd be great.
Will do.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting on the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code, which is now in session. I'm Mike Romano, Committee Chair. I'd like to begin with a roll call of committee members in alphabetical order. Judge Espinoza.
I'm present.
Judge Henderson. I see you.
I'm sorry, I'm present. I have a new puppy that's barking, so I went on mute and I'll go back on.
It's the best excuse in the world, so we allow that. Assembly Member Lee.
Here.
Justice Moreno.
I'm here. For the record, my birds are under confinement, so.
Senator Skinner.
Here.
Nice to see you all. Today we have a packed agenda. We've invited 13 witnesses to discuss how to improve victim and survivor rights and services in California. At the end of today's session, we'll take public comment, as we always do, and we'll take a couple breaks along the way. Tomorrow, we'll discuss what we heard today and set priorities for further research and development by staff. I'd like to make just a few opening remarks, and then we'll get to our first panel. Today, we will explore rights and services for people who are victims of crimes. This committee has devoted much of its attention to incarceration and crime rates, public safety, and the details of the penal code. And though we have heard from crime victims in the past, this is the first time that the committee is focused exclusively on victims' rights and needs. Before going further, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that crime victims and survivors gathered at the Capitol today with Californians for Safety and Justice and Attorney General Rob Bonta calling for new, more effective solutions to the problems faced by crime victims in particular. And coincidentally, that's why we're here today. The topic, like almost everything the committee covers, arouses strong emotions that don't resolve into easy solutions. California has a strong victims' rights in its constitution and in penal code, but surveys of crime victims have shown that many are unaware of these rights and most do not feel well served by the system. We also know that a large percentage of crime goes unreported. According to a survey by the United States Department of Justice, only about half of violent crime and 1/3 of property crime is even reported to law enforcement across the country. In addition, violent crime disproportionately affects people of color and people with low household incomes. These statistics show that the system is not serving all of the crime victims well. Today's hearing explores these issues from several different angles. While not everyone agrees, I expect some common themes we'll hear today will be that victims want more information and more choice about what happens to those who've caused them harm. We'll also hear about victim restitution and compensation and the difference between the two. Victim compensation is a particularly important and under-recognized aspect of California's criminal legal system, which pays about $50 million a year to crime victims to reimburse them for the harm that was done to them. Finally, we'll hear about restorative justice, a topic the committee has addressed in the past, but this time we'll hear about it from a victim's point of view. And as always, we'll examine data and how these programs can help recompense crime victims and improve public safety to create fewer crime victims in the future, which of course, I think we're all interested in. So now we'll turn to our first panel. I want to thank everyone to join us for sharing their insights with the committee. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to make opening remarks, and we will reserve the rest of our time for Q&A and conversation with the committee. Panelists, thank you for your time. Please know that if you've submitted a written submission, we have read it. So in your opening remarks, please move quickly to the high points so we can move on to the conversation, which is usually the most important and productive part of our meeting. For our first panel, we'll hear about victim and survivor rights and services. We'll discuss the current state of victims' rights in California and identify some specific areas of concerns for victims, including retailers who are here today. Our panelists are Miriam L. Menchawi, who's the director of California Victims for Legal Resources Center, which is an entity that was created by the Penal Code to assist crime victims. Rachel Michelin, who's president and CEO of the California Retailers Association, and Ralph Diaz, president for Stand Up for Victims and former secretary of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Professor El Menchawi, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this important discussion about victims' rights in the criminal justice system, and for highlighting this area as an area to focus on. As you mentioned, I'm the director of the California Victims Legal Resource Center and have been so for over 9 years. I've had the honor to help hundreds of victims of different crimes across California who are going through various stages of the criminal justice system. I also provide direct representation to crime victims with rights enforcement and teach at McGeorge School of Law, specifically victims in criminal procedure. California has been the leader in the victims' rights movement, passing the first Victims' Bill of Rights in 1982, and then through the proposition process, passing Prop 9, also known as Marsy's Law, in 2008. Marsy's Law gives victims 17 rights in the California Constitution. These rights are intended to ensure that victims are treated in a fair and respectful way through the criminal justice system, and that they have the opportunity to participate in a meaningful way through the process. I want to just take a few minutes to take a step back and think about why victims' rights are important and why victims need rights as they're going through the process. Nobody asks to be a victim of a crime. Victims are propelled into this very complicated system that involves many players representing different interests. As you're all aware, the prosecutor represents the state of California and is not the victim's attorney. Hence, the victim is an independent participant in the process, and in most cases has to navigate this process without the assistance of an attorney or anybody who can really guide them in a meaningful way regarding the rights. Victims are not an appendage of the prosecutor, and there are many instances where the victim's interests are different than the prosecutor's interest. And this is one reason that these rights are important, because they give victims the opportunity to be treated and heard as an independent participant in the process, an independent participant with unique interests. While I don't have time to go into detail regarding the specifics of the rights today, they're basically boiled down to ensuring that victims are protected as they're going through the process, that they have access to information about the case and the ability to participate in a fair way and seek restitution. Victims' rights are all about fairness in the process and not controlling the outcome of the case. And that's not to say that all victims have the same level of interest in participating in the process. Some victims are interested in engaging with the criminal justice system, while others want nothing to do with the process and therefore can be harmed by having to engage with it. Victims' rights are there to ensure that they have the opportunity to decide how they want to participate in the process. So problem solved, right? Victims' rights are important. We have constitutional rights. Unfortunately, the problem is not solved. The knowledge and implementation of Marsy's Law has been spotty at best, and there's plenty of room for improvement. The current state of victims' rights in California is dire. Let's start with just the threshold issue of notification about these rights, which is actually one of the 17 rights that victims have under Marsy's Law. Unfortunately, as mentioned in the opening, victims are often unaware of the rights because they either have not been notified at all or they have not been provided with meaningful notification. I'm going to give you a best case scenario where victims get notice of the rights. They're provided with a copy of their Marsy's Law card, which is basically a piece of paper with the constitutional text pasted on it. And I want you to think, is this sufficient notice? I give this card to my third-year law students, so students who are trained in reading the law, and ask them to decipher what it means, and they have a hard time doing so. So imagine giving this paper to somebody who has just gone through a traumatic event, who's not trained to read the law. Will they be able to decipher it and understand what these rights mean? Another issue that's causing lack of enforcement is lack of knowledge by system players. Unfortunately, there is sparse training and limited knowledge about these rights by system players, which leads to these rights being ignored altogether. We also have to be mindful and aware of the limitations of our system-based advocates who are not attorneys and also are part of the law enforcement team, which creates limitations for them in providing information and guidance. In addition to the lack of knowledge about the rights, there is also lack of legal clarity about some of the fundamental issues pertaining to the rights, including how victims should request their rights. If you had the chance to look at the Marcy's Law Card, you will notice that 6 of the rights have to be requested. And the upon request is written in the middle of the sentence describing the right. Although these rights have to be requested, there's no guidance given on how to request it. Do you send a letter? Do you call on the phone? Who do you request it to? Do you contact the DA? Is it your advocate? Do you have to tell the judge directly? And then when do you put in the request? Do you have to put it in by a specific time during the criminal process? Do they expire? There's a lack of appeals decisions interpreting these rights, and that's because victims don't have access to legal representation to challenge and address rights violations, and these are their constitutional rights that are being violated, and unfortunately, they're being violated without any recourse for victims. So in the end result of this lack of enforcement is that victims see these rights as mere words on paper, often telling me that it's not even worth the paper that it's printed on. And this is very harmful for our legal system for several reasons. I'll talk about 2. The first is the impact that it has on the victim's recovery process. Enforcement of victims' rights has been shown to be critical to the long-term recovery of crime victims. The way that victims are treated in the process can either help avoid or exacerbate secondary victimization. And that's the trauma that victims experience due to the way that they're treated as they're going through the criminal justice system. Second, lack of enforcement impacts victims' willingness to engage with the process, and also future reporting. So victims often feel like they lose their privacy right and agency once the criminal justice system commences, and they end up feeling left out and ignored by the process, which causes them to engage and lose trust in the system and not report future crime. I'm not hopeless, though. I'm excited to be here because I think through your recommendations, your committee does have the opportunity to take steps to make these rights meaningful for victims. Victims should have access to meaningful assistance and representation, and courts should be checking in to ensure that victims were informed about their rights. So to make these rights a reality, I recommend that we provide victims with access to meaningful assistance that will allow them to decide whether, when, how, and to what extent they want to participate in the process. And they'll need attorneys to do this, the attorneys that represent their interests, that explain their rights and help guide them through the process. And even if we can't provide every victim with an attorney, we should at least be guiding them to where they can go to get independent information about their rights. My second recommendation is that judges should be responsible to ensure that victims were notified about the rights and to know if the victims have requested to participate so that the system won't leave them out. And I did want to give you an example of Nevada County that uses a certificate of compliance form where the judges are notified by system players or the victim's rights attorney regarding 1, whether the victim was notified about his or her rights, 2, whether the victim requested to participate, and 3, who's responsible to notify the victim of criminal justice events. So we should be encouraging and hopefully recommending that a similar form be used in criminal courts across California. And in addition to those 3 items, we should also make sure that victims understand that the prosecutor doesn't represent them and that they can have their own attorney that represents their interests. I think
I'm sorry to interrupt. We want to get into this, but I'm trying to keep everybody to about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I was actually just wrapping up. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I look forward to your questions.
Terrific. And again, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just trying to keep everybody on schedule. Rachel Michelin.
Hello, well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Appreciate the opportunity. As I was preparing, I thought, you probably are wondering, why is retailers here talking about victims and victims' rights? And I want to share with you that from the retail industry perspective, in California retailers, we represent both large national retailers, but we also represent local and small retailers up and down the state of California. Obviously, there's been a lot of attention paid to particularly retail theft over the last few months. We saw, unfortunately, a string of of smash and grabs over the holidays, during Thanksgiving. We've seen parts of the state where retailers have had to close stores early, or they are leaving markets altogether due to retail theft. And this is something that, and I'm so pleased to see Senator Skinner, because I think she has been very actively engaged on this issue with cow retailers for many years and trying to find solutions to this. So when we talk about victims from our perspective, there's actually two groups that I'd like to address. One is that our first priority is the safety of our employees and the safety of the customers who come into our stores. That's our number one goal. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is increased violence against our employees when it comes to retail theft. We're seeing our customers being traumatized. Imagine, I talked with a mom whose daughter happened to be in a store over the holiday season that witnessed one of these brazen smash and grabs where 80 people came in. The young woman was there with her girlfriend shopping, and she was victimized. She's terrified to go into a store because she's afraid she's going to be victimized again. And sometimes we forget that. A lot of times when I talk about retail theft, people talk about the store, the retailer, and they forget that there are real people in those stores. That's a workplace for our retail employees. And that's where many members of the public go in to shop. In addition, when you talk about in some parts of the state where stores have had to close early, that wasn't a decision made by corporate, that was done by the employees because they don't feel safe. And so we have been really spending a lot of time over the last few months. I've been talking with a lot of folks on how do we find solutions? How can we be part of the solutions to this instead of just sitting back and saying, well, this is a problem, we need all of you to fix it. The other victims groups that we also represent, and I feel very strongly about, is some of the folks that are committing these crimes in the first place. And that might seem a little strange to you, but what we are seeing more and more, particularly when we talk about organized retail crime, and these are crime rings that utilize retail theft, then to turn around and in some cases they sell it in swap meets and fencing operations on the online marketplaces. They use the proceeds of these stolen goods to fund other criminal activities. And what we're seeing more and more is these crime rings, they're utilizing and they're recruiting vulnerable populations. We know that in some of the smash and grabs that happened in November, they were going and recruiting juveniles to commit these crimes. They have gone down in Southern California, you might have seen the cargo theft, and with Union Pacific, we know by undercover informants, they went and they targeted homeless populations where they pay them maybe $100 to commit these crimes. And these folks then turn over those stolen goods. So we also want to be part of the solution in making sure that we can provide services to those vulnerable populations, particularly through not only diversion programs, which we are strong supporters of, but frankly, we are going to be putting in programs in California on job training. Many of my members will tell me, Rachel, we'd rather hire someone than have them steal from us. And retailers have always been on the forefront when it comes to hiring people with criminal records. They've been on the forefront of banning the box. And they really are about restorative justice and making sure that people can have a second chance. And in many cases, in their stores up and down the state of California, folks who had made, maybe some negative life choices prior to, they were able to get into a job training program, particularly in the retail industry, and they've gone on to be very successful. So we really look at our solution in a four-pronged approach. One is, how do we dismantle? And how do we dismantle particularly these organized crime rings? And I know I gave you a background paper, so I'm not going to go into detail, but we are very supportive of the organized retail crime task forces that became in existence in 2018. California leads the nation. We're watching states across the country mirror what we're doing with our organized crime ring or organized retail crime task forces. And we really look forward to working with the governor's office and the state legislature and increasing the funding and the ability to expand that program throughout the state. Disrupt. We are really finding that the online marketplaces are a place that these crime rings are utilizing, and that's where they go and victimize these vulnerable populations. We're very supportive of legislation that's pending in the state assembly right now, authored by Senator Skinner, to put some guardrails around the online marketplace. This mirrors legislation that's currently pending in Congress. And we think that California, again, can lead in showing that we're going to cut off the opportunity for these crime rings to quickly sell these stolen goods to then fund not only continuing to victimize vulnerable populations, but fund other criminal activities. Deter. So we're looking at legislation and sponsoring legislation around deterring. One of the things that we have seen is the constant repeat of folks going into stores and continue to steal. You know, what this does is, unfortunately, we've heard stories from our workers who they'll get on the bus home with someone, or they'll be on a train home with people that they know have been into their store 2 or 3 times that day, stealing from them. And what does that do for the morale of our employees? So we're looking at opportunities to deter people and make sure they understand the impact that they're truly having, not only on the victims, which are our employees and our customers, but on the communities and the neighborhoods in which these retailers operate. And then finally, divert. We are strong supporters of diversion programs. We are ready to bring in diversion programs, particularly targeted at retail theft, and couple that. More importantly, you can't just do a diversion program. We want to couple that with job training. And we, again, are ready to bring in our job training programs into California that focus not only in terms of stores and retail, but we've added modules pertaining to logistics to really deal with some of the challenges we're facing, not only in California, but nationally with our supply chain. So retailers are all in. You know, I never thought I was going to become a victim's advocate, but I feel like I am. I feel like, and more importantly, we want to be advocates for the people who are being preyed upon by these organized crime rings. The organized crime rings, those are folks that need to be held accountable for what they're doing, because what they're doing is far more than retail theft. That's why we have the organized retail crime task forces. But we really need to work collectively on how we can address the other victims, which are not only our employees and our customers, but these vulnerable populations who are really being led astray. They are not getting the help they need. There are homeless populations that we know continue need to get in touch with the services that the state has been funding. And retailers are here to help any way we can. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you today and look forward to the robust conversations and questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very interested in exploring some of those issues further. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Diaz, who I think has really interesting experiences, both working with victims, but also past extensive experience working within the prison system in California. Afternoon, Mr. Diaz.
Afternoon. Thank you for your invitation. Good to talk to you again, Michael. Good to see you, Senator Skinner, and everyone else. Judge Henderson, very good to see you. So I got involved with victims advocacy right after my retirement from the Department of Corrections. After spending 30 years in corrections, what I mainly focused on was the rehabilitation and incarceration of those who are sent to the state prison system. But along the way, one group that I did not have enough engagement with was the victims groups or victims specifically directly. And it wasn't until I started reaching the higher levels of corrections when I began to meet with victims group with the implementation of the various propositions and the changes and regulations within CDCR, I would meet with victims groups as a collective. And I would tell you, in preparing for the meetings with victims groups, I would do a lot of research, I would study, I would prepare. And after the meetings, I was anticipating a very focused, a very tough meeting to explain why these changes were necessary within the agency, within corrections, and why the growth of rehabilitations and credits and reducing our prison population was necessary. I left the meetings when they were terminated. I felt as if not enough was said. Not enough pointed questions were given to me or the other agency leaders. And when I was in the position of secretary with the implementation of Proposition 57, which was a very complex proposition to implement, victims groups, I believe they didn't have enough time with me and corrections to properly explain what the credits meant, why they were important, why it was important to add credits to encourage rehabilitation. And it's one of those things after you leave a career, you always think, well, there are things that you wish you could have done, things you wish you could have spent more time with. people you could have spent more time with, and one of those was the victims and the group, specifically victims directly. So soon after, I started getting contacted directly about by victims, just basically about credits and what did they mean and how complex they were, and having to explain to victims why a person was sentenced to a certain year by the court, but with the credit system, it now was expedited. And it was complex. They are complex issues. And I don't believe the counties were prepared to clearly articulate those changes. And in turn, what I felt and what I witnessed and what I heard was frustration from victims. Victims that felt that they weren't given the whole truth about the sentencing of the individual sent to the state prison system. And to me, I think what that does is victimizes them again. They weren't properly informed. And if you go online to try and figure out the credit schemes that were established by corrections, it's really hard to interpret. And it's really hard to understand, which then in turn leads to frustration by victims. I think with what's going to be important with this group and this committee is that one of the recommendations that I am proposing is that the committee put together with corrections and with the courts a more clear and understandable schedule for victims, for courts, for district attorneys, for public defenders, so they can explain the true sentence that an individual would be receiving based on the crime that they committed, based on the sentence they received, or the plea bargain that was entered into. Because each one of those has a different credit earning scheme to it. Another thing that I really opened my eyes to victims was when I was afforded the ability to go to Norway to take a look at how that country transformed their criminal justice process. And my main intent was to go for twofold. One, to see how California corrections can humanize and bring some normalcy to the prison system. But along the way, one theme kept on coming up in my discussions was victims, how victims played a role on the front end on how they are treated in Norway. And one of the most fascinating things that was explained to me is that when a victim is awarded restitution by the courts in Norway, they are made whole up front soon after the court process is over, and the victim no longer has to wait or anticipate when would they be receiving the restitution for the losses that they incurred, for you name the scenario. And then the state would then have to deal with the incarcerated on figuring out how they'll get the restitution from him or her. But one of the things that really brought me to understand about victims was that if an individual in California is receiving restitution, they're going to be receiving it in small stipends. They're going to be receiving it from victims' compensation and small stipends. And every time they receive it, it's just a reminder of the crime in their healing process, rather than receiving it all up front as whole. Now, with the number of individuals incarcerated and the amount of restitution that's ordered and that's still owed, I couldn't even give you a number. But that would have to be studied. But there has to be a better way to treat victims in a way to where they're made whole up front, so their healing can begin and not having to revisit the crime every time a new check or a new restitution comes in the mail. And then also on those that are serving time in the incarceration, having to figure out how much they're paying back every time they receive funds from family, every time they earn money in prison, how much of that is going towards restitution. There has to be a better way to figure this out on both ends. And when I realized that, the inmates in Norway, they understood. The victims in Norway, they totally understood, and the citizens in Norway understood. Another piece in Norway that I realized that I think would help everyone involved with criminal justice in the victims arena would be that the victims are informed on the progress of the individual while they are incarcerated. They can opt in to understand what the individual is doing while they are in prison, so they can have a sense of understanding of what the person is doing. Some victims want to be involved with it, some don't want to be involved with it. But if an individual is going to be released eventually, I think the victim should be aware that this person did receive rehabilitation programs. They did better than themselves. They did participate in rehabilitative programs that improve their outcome, and they could, they're going to be productive citizens when released, versus having victims being unaware and afraid when the person leaves unnecessarily. So I think that would be an important piece that the committee could work on. And you can work on with corrections with that. I know it is possible. I say it easily now that I'm not the secretary, but I think with some conversation, with some work, I think that could be accomplished. And I would, yes.
Mr. Diaz, I just wanted to cut you out just because we want to keep as much for the conversation. Is one last piece you want to add to the table, and then we'll take it to a
Sure.
conversation.
Yeah, I think the last piece, in recent years, with all the changes that are happening in criminal justice, not only in California, but around the country, I do believe that meaningful engagement from victims needs to be had. I know scheduling meetings, talking to victims, at times it feels like boxes are being checked versus having real, true dialogue. And with the victims that I have encountered just in my work now, like the Benavides family, whose daughter, Michelle Benavides, was murdered in May of 21, with Onyx Pierce and Violet Giovanni, whose daughter, Leilani Beauchamp, was murdered in October of 2021. And in my long discussions with Jessica Corday, whose son Marquise was murdered in April of 2009, who the things that I hear from them, I think much of this could be addressed ahead of time. More meaningful conversations can be had with these victims on what is going on, what is the outcome, so they can have an input with the important changes that are being recommended by this committee here. Everything from the gang enhancements to your work with LWOPs and Third Strike. And it is one thing to talk about it as an advocate like myself, but it's something else to hear straight from the victims. That's where the conversation needs to be had, so you can hear from them, and you may find things beneficial that can help in your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all. Let me just jump right into the questions, because I think that I found a common theme, at least in part, between what Mr. Diaz and Professor El-Menshawi were saying. And then I'll get to you, Justice Marino, which is about information getting to the victims. And Professor El-Menshawi, I was particularly struck by, and it's really resonated with me, that unlike prosecutors and police and defense lawyers and judges, victims come into the system against their will, literally. And so in terms of getting better information to victims, which seems to be a top priority, among the top priorities, both sort of in court and what's going to happen, but also what Mr. Diaz was saying, sort of credits and what are the consequences of going on. I worry that sort of legislating some document would be, a huge book of all the options and consequences. And like you said, people get the Victims' Bill of Rights, and it's very difficult to decipher. But then I think at the end, right as I was cutting you off, unfortunately, you said something that was going on that you thought was productive in Nevada County. And is that a model for something that you think is a good way of at least beginning to accurately and succinctly and in plain English explain the rights? Can you explain that process a little bit? And is that possible to scale up statewide, and something that could be, legislation around it?
Sure. Yeah. And that's an excellent question. I think the issue is, victims aren't even notified that they have these rights. And then the right to information actually has to be requested. So victims have to request to get information about the case. They have to request to get information about certain things that are happening, status, custody status, et cetera. So this form is intended to be a way that you put the onus on the judge. The judge is now checking in to make sure, A, that the victim was informed about the rights, so we can correct that problem. And B, whether or not the victim has requested some of the rights. It's not a perfect form by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And if we can scale it up, and I think it can be used on a statewide level, that way, I think the system can at least be taking steps to ensure that victims are notified of these rights, because the way that the system works now is just not working. Victims aren't aware that they even have these rights and that they have to request them.
And as far as your understanding, this was just implemented by the Superior Court of Nevada County on their own?
It's a local form, yeah, that's used in Nevada County, yeah.
And presumably it could include some of the details that Mr. Diaz was saying too, in addition.
Exactly, yeah. And then it also specifies who's responsible to notify the victims. That's another thing. It's like, well, who's responsible? Is the advocate, is the DA, is somebody from probation, et cetera? It helps, provide guidance as to who's responsible.
That's very interesting. Justice Moreno.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for those remarks from all three presenters. I just have one question for Professor Minshawi and one for Secretary Diaz. With respect to Professor Minshawi, you referred to the possibility of having some kind of legal assistance provided to victims of crime. And I'm wondering if you contemplate that would be publicly assisted legal assistance, or would you contemplate for private attorneys, plaintiffs' attorneys, in that capacity? And if so, would there be any restriction in terms of the contingency fee as there is in workers' compensation claims? In other words, is there a role for private plaintiffs' counsel in assisting victims of crime and recovering some kind of restitution in connection with the crime?
Thank
That's
you.
my first question.
Thank you for your question. And yeah, I mean, legal assistance is available now under grant funding. So we are grant funded through the California Office of Emergency Services to provide legal representation. And victims can, through restitution, request attorney's fees for assistance with restitution matters. So I think in terms of using private counsel, victims can use it. I think it would be hard to offer a victim's rights attorney for every single victim,
Right.
just because of the burden on the system. So I think grant funding is definitely the way to go. And we do have, through our penal code, a center that's available for victims, which is the Victims Legal Resource Center, where victims can call to get information about their rights. The gap is the knowledge of the center. So it's in the penal code, but then victims aren't really notified that there's this place that they can go to get information about their rights. So even if we can't afford as a system to provide direct counsel for every single victim, we can at least guide them to an agency that can help educate them and inform them about their rights, how to make the request, et cetera. But in an ideal world, the victims should be offered an attorney, and there is grant funding available to do so in California.
And with respect to privately retained counsel, is there a limitation, as there is in workers' comp cases, as to the contingency that a lawyer would be able to charge?
Yeah, I believe that's in the penal code for restitution matters where the victim does hire a victim's rights attorney. And I can get you that citation and information after the meeting. That'll be helpful.
Okay. Thank you. My question for Secretary Diaz, again, thank you for that presentation. Would you be suggesting, Mr. Secretary, that upon sentencing a defendant, typically the sentencing judge will say, I'm sentencing you to the midterm of 3 years with or any number of days or months. Would you also require a statement by the court to say that, assuming credits for good time, work time, your actual time in custody would be X number of months, which would be considerably less than say the 3 years, the sentence that was actually imposed? I mentioned that because in one of the sentencing trials this week, the judge not only gave credit, but also said basically something to the effect that your sentence of 2 years is actually 16 months. And typically the press will report the actual time served or when they would be eligible for parole. But I don't think that that's something that is required by the penal code. So my question is, would you require sentencing judges to, assuming good conduct credits, that the amount of time to be served by a defendant would be stated on the record? And that way, the victims would know firsthand from the sentencing document or from the transcript that the defendant would actually serve not the actual, say, 3 years, but something considerably less than that.
Thank you for that question. That's a very good question. I think something like that would be very helpful to the victims to truly understand after the long court process that occurred, after having them providing input and having them provide victims' witness statements and everything in the end, at the end, they could have a true glimpse of what the individual would truly be serving based on the credits that he would be awarded just based on the crime and the credits. Although an individual can, lose some of those credits by disciplinary, that there could be a caveat in there, but it would have to be something to the effect right up front. If everything goes as planned and he follows his or her rehabilitation plan, this would be their true release date.
Right.
Go ahead.
Because we know that in certain crimes, it's 50%, other crimes, they serve 80%. And I don't think the public generally is aware of that.
Correct. And at times when the inmate is, once they're received in corrections, sometimes they don't know.
Yeah.
And then confusion happens within corrections. But I think for the victim's sake, they could get a better sense and prepare themselves when the date that the individual is released from custody. So they're aware. Not only is it important for the determinately sentence, it's important for the indeterminately sentence also. Those that will be receiving Board of Prison hearings with these credits, their time could be expedited also, and the victim would be receiving notices of upcoming board hearings, sometimes years before they anticipated, which is not a pleasant event when they felt that they were caught off guard.
Thank you.
There are other questions from committee members? I have a million.
I have a question. I believe it was Professor Menshawi that talked about job training program as part of the program. Was that correct, Professor?
I don't think that was me. Maybe Rachel.
Okay, maybe it's Miss Michelin. Was it you talked
That
about
was
a
me.
job?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask you about that because for a number of years, I've been a federal judge all my career, but I actually was a state judge in a sense that Judge Henry Ramsey, some of you might remember, who's passed on, had a diversion program, and Kamala Harris, as district attorney, and had a diversion program. And I actually served as a judge on the diversion court that they both created. And a mantra that I heard over and over, and this was for years, of these people who were committing crimes. It wasn't smashing and entering, but a lot of them were drugs, but petty theft and things like that, was that they did it because it's better than flipping burgers at McDonald's, was the mantra that you would hear. And this program, Kamala Harris's program, had an alignment with the Goodwill, in which these people, as part of the diversion, if they didn't have a job, they would get a job with Goodwill and actually have a job and actually earning money. And it was very successful. The program was very successful because they saw new hope that they didn't see before they were doing this. And I'm just wondering if the job training ensures a job. What's the nature of the job training? It's one thing to train for a job, and it's another to actually get someone a job. Can you tell us more about that?
So the program's called RISE, and it's in collaboration with our National Retail Federation. So they actually do this program in other states. We're trying to bring it into California, and it's funded by mostly national retailers. And in order to be part of the program as a retailer, I can't say they're going to guarantee a job, but they guarantee that they will interview anyone who goes through the program. And I will say at this point, we have a labor shortage in California. We have a labor shortage in retail. So we actually see it as a win-win. And the majority of folks, and I'm happy to get you, Judge, more of the statistics and that if you're interested, but the majority of people do end up getting placed in a position. And if you go through the program, it's not just one retailer. So multiple retailers might offer you an interview. So you also have the ability to pick and choose where you'd like to go and work. Mm-hmm. And many times these folks, and we see the success stories, they go on to get into management positions, they go into leadership programs. And so we really look at it as a win-win for the industry. Other states have worked directly with their Department of Corrections. They've taken the program inside corrections facilities to actually get them a head start when they come out on some of this job training. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. Candidly, I'm looking for folks who would want to partner with us. California, it's a different animal. We're so big that it's, where do you start? And so we thought that at least using this possibility of really, we don't want just diversion programs. We want to make sure that if we move forward with diversion programs, we're able to bring our program in and hopefully set an example for other industries that they do the same. And so it's actually been very successful. Happy to get you more information if you're interested.
I'd love that.
I'm interested in that as well, and I just want to follow up on that. So again, this is a program called RISE, which is a job training program that's paid for by the National Retailers Association. Is that correct?
Well, it's paid, through National Retailers Invest. They pay for it through the foundation.
Okay. And the idea is, and when you say diversion, and excuse us, we're a bunch of lawyers and judges here.
Sorry.
Okay. No. I just want to just make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yeah,
that
I'm not. So full disclosure.
No. I don't want you to, I don't want everybody to get caught up on buzzwords is what I'm trying to say. But I just want to make sure that we understand is that you in general support a program where in lieu of incarceration or restitution to Walgreens, which that somebody can instead go through RISE or some other approved program rather than be incarcerated. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, but before they go through the RISE program, we'd like them to go through there's like a shop, we're partnering with the national shop. So let's just talk about like shoplifting, right? The old shoplifting term. We want them to go through a shoplifting program that is actually funded. It's another program funded by retailers so that they understand there's some consequence, and the consequence is maybe sitting and doing a 3-hour program on the impacts that they've had on whatever that diversion program is. And then once they do that, then they're eligible to go into, in our case, our RISE program. And then we would give them that opportunity to say, hey, we'd now like you, if you would like to, you have access to this program. It's all online, and so they go through these modules, and there's different modules that take, and again, I can send you the whole program. But then once they finish that, then they're eligible to be interviewed by a national retailer. And our goal would be, frankly, I would say what I'd love to see happen if we can get this working in California is then we have our small independent retailer program that we have through CRA. We'd like then to bring them into the program so that it can actually help smaller retailers in their communities, particularly minority-owned businesses in different parts of California. So there's a lot of potential to it, but I think that the piece, there does need to be a piece that they do through some sort of education so that they understand that stealing and going in from, it's wrong. But yet at the same token, we want to then offer them the carrot of the job training.
And do the offenders or the people who committed the crime, do they pay for these programs, or are they fully paid for by the foundations? Okay.
They're paid for. And in California, we would also look, we have our own foundation. We would look to raise money from our member companies to help fund it. So, this isn't about putting people in jail. We think it's a win-win, but we need some help legislatively to make sure that this can happen. And I think it could be a gold standard for other states to see how we can do this type of a partnership when it comes to these types of lower level crimes.
And I have a couple more questions. I'm sorry. As far as you know, do other states have this as part of the legislation? It's legislated?
I don't believe it's legislated specifically. What I do know is other states, they provide grants to other kind of retail associations to bring the programs into like Department of Corrections and those types of things. They also partner with community colleges and some other, again, I'm happy to get that info to you. It's a little daunting when I look at California, it's like, where do you start? And so that's what we're trying to figure out is how do we make this the most effective? But in terms of specific legislation, no.
Well, as I said, this is just the beginning of a conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Related. So since you mentioned shoplifting, it's obviously been in the news a lot. The data that California produces is old. For example, the latest statewide data that California publishes is of 2020, right? Can you give us any idea, is shoplifting dramatically on the rise? Is it not on the rise? Is it within variable? Can you give us any
Yeah.
perspective
So
on that?
that's a huge, I'll be honest, that's an issue that also retailers have to own, is that the data is not there. What we've done is, we try to get data from our member companies. That's hard to do because now you start the finger pointing where retailers will say, well, why should we report it? The law enforcement won't come. Law enforcement doesn't come because it's not prosecuted and all of that. And so I would say based on just shared experiences and it's not, this is just what I've observed. It is on the rise. It's been on the rise for a while. But to your point, Chairman, I've asked my member companies, we have to do a better job. Now, we are sponsoring legislation that I think might help with that. But we really need to get everyone on the same page. And what our ask has always been, whether it's of the governor or of the attorney general, is that we need to get retailers, law enforcement, district attorneys, all together to figure out how we can do a better job of getting the data, because it's not there. And I'm open to suggestions on how to do that, because that seems to be one of the most challenging aspects of this entire issue.
Well, you're preaching to the choir on the data issue. And the last question, then I'll stop monopolizing the conversation, is you talked about the organized retail theft. So in California, we have an organized retail theft law, which is separate from shoplifting. And I was wondering if you feel like that law is sufficient or not. Again, I know you're not an attorney, but so we do have a law that says if you act in concert with another person, and it ramps up if you do it more than once. So it does capture some of the issues that you were discussing. And I was wondering if that specific law you thought was sufficient.
It is to the extent that, and then I'm going to, call out what Senator Skinner's doing. I mean, coupled with what she's doing with the online marketplace, I think when that law was passed, we weren't seeing, the emphasis on the online marketplace and what's going on there. I mean, I don't know how many of you've done it. I've done a lot of research. It's crazy out there. All of the stolen materials that is popping up on the online marketplace, and there really isn't any transparency. That's why this legislation is so important. But I will say one of the biggest challenges we hear is that retailers in particular, when it comes to these organized retail crime cases, and these are multi-million-dollar cases, they cross state lines, some of them cross country. They're different countries are engaged in it, is that what we're finding is that these cases aren't being prosecuted. So we have a backlog of cases that are not being prosecuted. And so that's where we'd like to see some more emphasis put in and some more ability for cross-jurisdictional prosecution of these cases. Part of the proposal in the governor's budget that we've asked for is dedicated prosecutors through the attorney general for these organized retail crime task forces so that they can prosecute these crimes. Because what happens is if these cases sit there for 2 to 3 years and they're never prosecuted, they're just continuing to do that behavior. So I think it's there. I think there needs to be some tweaks to it. And I think the biggest tweak is that we really need to get these cases prosecuted quicker than what's happening currently.
Now, that is always difficult from a state level perspective because each county and prosecutor, sets their own priorities.
Yeah.
I do appreciate what you're saying about the online world, which I honestly had not realized. I sort of assumed that it was more people selling stuff on the corner and whatnot, but okay, well, that's why we're here to learn. And I assume that this people selling stuff on the corner isn't the big problem. It's the bigger problems, what you're saying, the multi-million-dollar program.
Yeah, I would say that what's happened now is the things that you see being sold on the street or on the corner, those are more people making money. They have a drug habit. They're feeding a drug habit, right? It's more, it's staying within that community. But what we're seeing on the online marketplace, it's just, it's crazy. I mean, there's one online marketplace. I'm not even a professional and I can tell how many, you don't need 300 things of Tide that you're selling for $3, and that's what they're advertising. And so when you see these big smash and grabs, you see these people going in and walking out with backpacks full of things, it's immediately going on to these marketplaces. And it really is. And it's detrimental, particularly to our small businesses and to our minority-owned businesses, because it's putting them out of business because people are just going to the online marketplace. And a lot of consumers don't understand that you see a really good deal on something, it's probably stolen. And so we're trying to educate on that end.
No, I appreciate that. And if there's a gap in the law, that seems like an area that, that is ripe for our committee. As I said, I was monopolizing. Do other folks have questions? Senator Skinner?
The retail thing is complicated, obviously. I mean, in a weird way, this both the online, some of it, not always, and the organized retail theft is really big criminal enterprises. So it's kind of like tackling the drug trade, and that we can do, and what is easier to arrest is the people on the lower end of the food chain of these things. And they're not really, that's not going to solve it. We can arrest a lot of them, and then there's, so it's just a harder one to get at. But if we go back to victims, I like the idea of what the retailers are trying, and obviously more diversion and more having less, if less of those individuals were susceptible to being able to be recruited that way from these organized crime rings, then that could help. It won't eliminate it, but it could help a great deal. But that, I think, and maybe it's the next panel we'll get more into, but I think when we talk about the victims, what we provide for victims and what victims' rights are. So as Professor Al-Manshawi pointed out, California does have a very robust set of victims' rights. However, the victims don't always know. And the other thing is that in the way that we what's the word? Our structure for supporting the victims with what the state has set up kind of picks winners and losers and victims. It has some barriers around who's considered, for who's the victim that is worthy of receiving our the programs that we've provided. And the result of that is it alienates people who are crime victims even more from the whole process, so that they are then less willing to be cooperative with public safety and law enforcement. And so it just adds, if we think about why are we supporting victims beyond that it's the right thing to do, it can improve public safety. And so, but it has to be done in a way that actually gets at that objective of improving public safety. So it really has to help, everyone who is a victim of crime, or you don't achieve the same benefit in a public safety way. So it's something that I've been, like Ralph, ever since I started getting involved in all of these criminal justice issues, have really started thinking about a lot. And I'm going to be carrying a bill on one aspect of it. It doesn't cover everything, but I certainly, listening to Professor Al-Manshawi, I started thinking, well, we really need to include in it better information, a better process for notifying the victims of what is available to them. And I'm thinking already, I need to put that in my bill. There's no, if I'm going to be taking on trying to add a good deal of reforms to it, I should be really thinking very comprehensively. So.
We have time for one or two more questions. All right, well then I'll take him. Professor Al-Manshawi, I just want to clarify. So you had really talked about sort of what are your rights and availability for restitution, availability for the services primarily of your office, it seems like. And then Mr. Diaz described what happens to somebody, what happens to the offender, the person who's committed the crime in prison, when would they possibly be released, what's their parole? Do you think that those, I just want to confirm that you think that those will go hand in glove, or do you think that crime victims, they just really want to be like, they want their restitution, they want, and they don't really care what happens at the end, or is it all go together? Not mutually exclusive, of course, but I think that one of the things that Mr. Diaz brought up, which I thought was kind of interesting and hadn't thought of before, is how these restitution checks that might trickle in might kind of re-traumatize people more and more. And you get a restitution check for like $23. Does that seems like almost insulting. I'm sorry, just for some folks. I mean, for some folks, $23 might be meaningful, but of course, it's a budgetary issue. But I love the idea of trying to get more restitution paid by the government upfront, and have the person who's incarceration owe that restitution to the government, not to their actual victim. Anyway, I was wondering if you found resonance with what you thought were priorities with what Mr. Diaz was describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately with victims, one size doesn't fit all. We have to meet victims where they are. So some victims want to be involved, want to know everything from the beginning to the end and after. Other victims actually didn't call the police, the neighbor called the police, and now they're being forced to participate in this process that they want nothing to do with. So I think in terms of level of engagement through the process, we need to be checking in with victims to see what level they want to engage in the process. Do they want to be notified? Do they want to get letters, letting them know when the hearings are going to take place, or do they want to give a victim impact statement, et cetera. In terms of restitution, that's actually one of the most frustrating parts of victims' rights for victims, because a lot of times restitution is either ordered as TBD to be determined, or if it's ordered, the victims actually don't see any of it. I think what Mr. Diaz mentioned, the piecemeal payments is kind of almost a best case scenario, because a lot of victims get nothing. And they end up having to chase after people to get any type of payment for the restitution. And victim compensation, which I know our colleagues from Victim Comp will be presenting next, they don't cover all crimes, including property crimes, right? So all of the crimes that we just talked about, they're not covered by victim compensation. So those victims, their only way to get reimbursement is through restitution. I think in an ideal world, victims getting paid up front would be great. But if not, then let's at least create a system where victims have an opportunity to get something from the restitution check, a monthly payment. If it's guaranteed, that would be great.
Right. And as I know Mr. Diaz has said, otherwise, so many people can't pay, and then they leave prison and they are saddled with, $100,000, $20,000 worth of debt, which is just perpetuates the problem in a way. And anyway, Mr. Diaz, I'll give you the last word. Do you agree that some of the ideas that you were saying in terms of making sure that victims have full notice and are aware of the process marry well with what Professor El-Menshawi was saying?
I think they do. But just like the professor said, it's not a one size fits all scenario. And as victims heal, they grow in their process. 1 year, they may want nothing to do with the situation, but by year 2 or 3, they want to start getting involved. They want to be informed. They want to know. And I think those avenues need to be open for the victims. We just can't just put a one blanket policy that just on the front end, they have to, state their intentions with their involvement with the incarcerated, and just, year 20, assume it's the same, because it's not. We must continue to be engaging them. And just like their healing process takes time, we have to grow in our treatment of victims at the same way.
And I'm sorry, I said that was going to be the last question, but I had one last question. Is this something that could be done online as a statewide checkbox system? I want to know, here's my case number, I want to know all this stuff, or is that too pat a solution?
And that's too pat of a solution. I think there does have to be some direct engagement through, maybe possibly the Victims and Survivors Division within corrections, or via the county. But I think we have to engage victims to see what they feel would be the best way to hear from the county, versus trying to navigate a large state agency like corrections, which at times can be very impersonal.
Please, I'm very familiar with that. Professor El-Menshawi, do you agree that sort of non-online check would be a little bit too easy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at each county does things differently, even in terms of notification and in terms of not even after a person is incarcerated, even during the process. Each county does things differently. There are different agencies responsible. So it would be really hard, I think, to create a uniform system. In an ideal world, it would be great. But I think that counties need to have a clear system as to who's responsible for notifying and how the victim can contact them and make sure that our victims are connected with those services.
All right. Well, thank you so much. As I often say, no good deed goes unpunished. I am certain that we will be back in touch with you all to try to help develop some of these ideas. I really appreciate your time, and I want to move on to the next panel. And again, thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be in touch. And please be in touch with us if there are things that you think that we should be aware of that we weren't able to cover today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to try to move on to our next panel before we have a break. Is everybody okay with that?
I have to take a brief break, but I will come back within less than 10 minutes.
Okay, let's move on to our next panel, and then we'll take a break after our second panel. So our next panel will discuss ideas to improve California's current system of victim compensation and restitution, which we touched on briefly. And of course, I think it would be helpful to get a clear understanding of the difference between the two. Our panelists are experts on these issues in both California and nationally, and have extensive experience working with crime survivors. Our panelists include Dr. Gina Rodriguez Castro, who's assistant professor of University of San Francisco and director of Survivor Policy Prosecutors Alliance. Aswad Thomas, national director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And Delaney Green, technical teaching fellow at UC Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic. Tom, am I doing this in the right order?
You jumped ahead a little bit, Mike. We're actually going to hear from Linda Gledhill first from the California Victims Comp Board, and then move to that panel. So we jumped ahead a little bit, but
I apologize. My notes got out of place. Miss Glenhill, I apologize. Thank you for joining us. And I realize that you're going to speak separately from the panel about your special role in the system and try to explain what's going on for us. And that also that you're not really here to make policy recommendations, but more to explain the landscape for us so that we can make better policy recommendations in the future. Is that right?
Yes, yes, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
All right, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Linda Gledhill. I'm the executive officer of the California Victim Compensation Board. And since coming to CalVCB 2 years ago, I've been focused on improving our operations both internally and externally to better serve victims. Internally, I have focused on building a strong management team as well as ensuring that our technical security and infrastructure is up to date. And externally, I've assessed the needs of victims and how we may better serve them. I'm proud of the progress that we have made, including a sharp decrease in application processing time, but know there remains much more to be done. CalVCB was created in 1965 and was the first program of its kind in the nation. Our task is to serve those hurt by domestic violence, child abuse, sexual and physical assault, homicide, human trafficking, robbery, and vehicular manslaughter, among other crimes. Victims who suffer physical injury, threat of physical injury, or emotional injury as a direct result of these crimes may qualify for assistance. Their family members may also qualify. CalVCB provides up to $70,000 in reimbursement of expenses as the payer of last resort to cover costs created by the crime. These include medical and dental care, mental health services, income loss, funeral expenses, relocation costs, and residential security. Being the payer of last resort means that CalVCB can only pay expenses after other available sources of payment have been applied to a bill. Those sources include, but are not limited to, health insurance, workers' compensation insurance, automobile insurance, Medi-Cal, and Medicare. The benefits we provide and the requirements for receiving them are of course set out in government statute. Statutory guidelines and limitations are in place for several categories and impact how we process and pay claims. As a matter of operational order, CalVCB services come after a crime has been confirmed. As an organization, we do not determine whether crimes were committed. We validate that they were and compensate according to statute. The validation comes in many forms, including, but again, not limited to, police reports, mental health verifications, and medical records. Last fiscal year, CalVCB received more than 40,000 applications and paid $52.7 million in compensation to victims. The top 3 types of crimes we received applications for were assault, child abuse, and homicide. And the top 3 types of expenses we covered were mental health, funeral, burial, and income loss support. These are serious crimes with serious impacts, and staff at CalVCB are dedicated to helping every person we possibly can. There are additional statistics in our annual report, which summarizes our activities and key data from the previous fiscal year, which is available to the public on our website. In addition to our core mission of compensating victims of violent crime, CalVCB runs several other programs to help victims. We compensate people who have been wrongfully convicted of a crime and spent time in prison. These cases are commonly referred to as Penal Code Section 4900 cases. CalVCB also provides grants to trauma recovery centers, better known as TRCs, across the state to help victims of crimes. TRCs provide trauma-informed, evidence-based mental health treatment and case management services to crime victims who may not be eligible for victim compensation or may be fearful of reporting a crime to law enforcement. CalVCB currently funds 18 trauma recovery centers through grant agreements, which ensure that they meet statutory requirements. CalVCB also supports victims of mass violence events, such as the Las Vegas shooting, the Gilroy Garlic Festival, and most recently, the San Jose VTA shooting that occurred last May. In all cases, our goal is to help victims to begin to recover from the trauma they've endured and help them move on with their lives. In addition to direct victims of crime, we also cover what we call derivative victims. These victims are survivors of crime victims who have died, persons who are legally dependent upon the victim for financial support, and members of a victim's family, which may include parents, grandparents, siblings, spouses, children, or grandchildren of the victim. CalVCB is funded through restitution fines and penalty assessments levied on persons convicted of crimes and traffic offenses and restitution orders. CalVCB's main sources of funds are the Restitution Fund, federal reimbursements. We also receive support from the general fund. As I mentioned in the beginning, one thing I've worked hard to do at CalVCB is improve our efficiency and customer service. Through the implementation of workload tracking, we were able to better understand what processes were slowing us down and then create new processes to move applications more efficiently. I'm proud to say that we now process applications 40% faster than we did 2 years ago. The average application currently takes us 32 days to process, and we strive every day to continue to improve that number. Another important focus for me was to make it easier for victims to understand our program and submit an application. We overhauled our website to make it simple, easy to use, and victim-centered. We did this by clearly laying out eligibility requirements and the application process. California has a proud history of supporting victims, and over the years, CalVCB's mission has grown. We're often called upon to discuss the impacts of proposed legislation and how it can be enacted under our program. We gladly participate and share information so that we can continue to help victims in a manner that is statutorily appropriate. Under legislation enacted in 2019, victims of human trafficking are now entitled up to $10,000 a year for 2 years for income loss. So far, under this law, we have paid $2.1 million to more than 350 victims. And this past summer, the legislature created the Forced or Involuntary Sterilization Compensation Program to pay victims of state-sponsored forced sterilization. We launched that program on January 1st, and victims have until December 31st, 2023 to apply. While all 50 states have established a victim compensation program, California's is the most robust in the country in terms of the services provided to victims and the most complex in terms of its statutory requirements. We are focused on helping victims of crime recover from the pain and injuries caused by violent crime, or in the case of those wrongfully convicted or subjected to forced sterilization of a grave injustice. At CalVCB, we are driven by this important and meaningful mission that each year helps tens of thousands of Californians overcome traumatic personal experiences. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I just want to start with a very overly simple question, harder to ask than, can you just briefly describe the difference between compensation and restitution?
So we we pay bills. We compensate people for bills that they have incurred as a result of a crime, and we reimburse them for those bills. So we take, the application process is you're a victim of crime, you submit an application to us. We determine whether or not there was a crime and that you were an eligible applicant. And once we approve your application, you then submit to us bills that you have paid as a result of that crime. If we agree that those bills were directly related to the crime, then we will reimburse you for those bills. In some cases, we will work directly with a mental health provider or someone to pay those bills, but that is what we do. We process applications and pay and reimburse for bills.
But just to make clear, so somebody steals my cell phone on the street, and I might have mental health service, might require mental health services as a result, and my insurance doesn't cover it or whatever. You might cover my mental health services, but you wouldn't get me a new cell phone. And restitution pays for the new cell phone. Is that correct?
So if you were—
In theory, I'm just talking in broad strokes here.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, it's there. So the question, one of the questions we would have to determine for your application is, were you threatened when your cell phone was stolen? So you're saying somebody walked by you on the street, stole your cell phone, you felt physically threatened.
Let's say I was genuinely threatened and real trauma and all that business, and I genuinely need, I'm not saying, what I'm just trying to get is the difference between compensation and restitution. So I think I understand what compensation is. You know, you pay for funeral services and you pay for mental health treatment and other programs like that. But then what is restitution?
So the direct restitution order can go to Cal VCB. And that goes into the restitution fund, which is how we operate.
So I'm sorry. So somebody who is, a person who commits a crime is assessed the restitution fee, and that goes into your fund to pay for these programs. Is that right?
Correct. There can be a direct victim order, and that would go directly to the victim, or it can go to our fund.
But typically, in the typical case, when you hear they say, and you have to pay $1,000 in restitution, that goes to you to pay for these programs.
Yeah, I would say it does depend. There can be direct victim orders, right? And those direct victim orders go directly to the victim. And we can sometimes be a pass-through for those restitution dollars. Or if there is no victim identified, then the money would go into the restitution fund.
And then again, to get to my hypothetical about the stolen cell phone, you guys generally don't replace stolen items.
Correct.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Do other folks have questions? And okay, I'll keep on going again. You say you're funded in part by the state and in part by the federal, and then I guess in part by people who are paying restitution from the court.
Oh, the restitution fund, the federal money is reimbursement money, Federal Victims of Crime Act money. And so that is a reimbursement model. So we receive federal grants that reimburse money that we have paid out. And then because the restitution fund has declined over the years, we now receive general sense of support to be able to continue our operations.
Can you break down what is paid for by the state and what roughly and what is paid for by the feds?
So we get about $39 million from the general fund. And we have the restitution money is over a period of 3 years. So it's, it depends on how much we're paying out in each previous year.
Got it. And you said about $50 million. So
Yeah,
it sounds like the majority.
Correct.
It sounds like the majority comes from the general fund. Yeah, is that correct? I'm going to ask a question that you may not be able to answer, but I don't know. Were you able to listen to the prior?
I did.
Yeah. Have you heard of or thought about a restitution program like that suggested by Secretary Diaz about paying victims restitutions up front rather than waiting for checks to come through? Is that sort of what seems like what you do maybe?
Well, So there's two different parts to it. I mean, CDCR, and I think you're hearing from them in a later panel, they have an Office of Victim Services as well that handles victim services restitution on the CDCR side and the collection of that. What you're talking about wouldn't be allowed under our statutory scheme as it's currently set up.
Do you know other states that do that? Any states that do that?
I'm not aware of any states that do that.
Okay. Do you know of states that you think that are particularly good models for victims' compensation?
I think you would find that across the country, most people would say California is a model. We were the first. We have the largest program by far in terms of payments that we make, number of people that we serve, and what we cover.
I got it. And I apologize for venturing into policy questions that I told you that I wouldn't be asking, but do anybody else have any questions? All right, Ms. Glenhill, this was extremely helpful. As you said, this is a very complicated network. And I think, I mean, what seems like the work that you do is terrific, but in some ways resonates with what we were hearing on the previous panel about how complicated this can be. I really appreciate that it seems like a priority for you is to simplify that and to make it easier for victims to be able to access these monies, especially folks who are very desperate and have gone through really traumatic circumstances. I think that I hate to suggest things to Senator Skinner, but it's another thing for folks in court to be made aware of are the opportunities through Cal VCB that they may not be aware of.
No, yeah, we absolutely try to work with our county partners to make sure that we can reach as many victims as possible, and that continues to be our goal, to be able to serve as many people as possible.
Right, as we've heard from a lot of folks, they just feel very overwhelmed by the system. Victims obviously, again, come to the system not by choice and are almost by definition not experts in it, and it can be daunting on top of the trauma that they've gone through. So we appreciate that. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate it. All right. I know that I said that we would move on to our second panel next, but let's take a quick 5-minute break and reconvene at 2:30 for our next panel. Thank you.